Good, so do turn back to that part of Leviticus where we've focused in on chapter 9, but you've got a bit of chapter 8, a bit of chapter 10, and that's where we'll be basing our study this morning. Leviticus, of course, is the third book of the Bible, and through the first three books of the Bible, you see developing God's purpose and his plan for mankind. What is God's purpose? What is God's purpose and plan for humanity, for people? You see back in Genesis that God creates man in his image. He blesses them himself. We've been looking at that a bit with the young people this weekend. And he gives them a role to do in the world that he's created. He creates a man and a woman, and they can reflect something of God's love individually in their relationship together. But through all of this, they also have, crucially and most importantly, a relationship to the God who created them. If you look at Genesis 1 and 2, you see how God speaks to them. He communicates with them. He takes the man, he puts him in this place. He brings the woman. It's like he's leading her by the hand and he brings her to the man. He walks among them. God relates directly with the people that he has created. They hear him. They experience his presence among them without fear. And you can read the first two chapters and you think, this is amazing. How is this going to develop? You know, what could happen in this relationship between God and mankind? What's it going to look like? And then suddenly everything crashes down when you get to chapter 3. Then comes sin, willfully going against what God has commanded. It leads to death. Immediately, Adam and Eve hide themselves in fear from the presence of God as he walks in the garden. For the first time, the presence of God is a terrible thing to them. And then God himself, following the curse of the fall, he himself, where he has led them in, he now drives them out. And he places cherubim and a flaming sword, so there's no way back into the tree of life and the Garden of Eden. Well, the next three books of the Bible, and indeed all the way through the rest of the Bible, but particularly the next three books, are there to tell us that God is still going to do something. God is still going to do something about his relationship with mankind, and he still has an amazing purpose. And then through the rest of the Bible, you see how that purpose works out and what God is doing to achieve it. God still wants to relate to people who are still made in his image, though that image is spoilt and that image is broken. And God himself is going to break down the barriers to this. So we're going to look today at what's happening here in Leviticus 9, which is a real high point and a real crucial step in God showing what it is that he's doing and showing how he wants to relate to mankind as the people get to see God's glory. We're going to look first of all at the way to see God's glory, then the blessing of seeing God's glory, but then also as we get into the beginning of chapter 10, the danger of God's glory as well. Leviticus chapter 9 is really the climax of what God has been planning. And in some ways, it's one of the high points of the whole of the Old Testament. Back in Genesis, God reveals himself to Abraham. And he explains to Abraham that God is going to relate to him and to his family in a special way. I'm going to read a couple of verses from Genesis chapter 17, where God is making a covenant, a promise with Abraham. And God says this to him in verse 7. He says, "And I will establish my covenant between me and you and your offspring after you throughout their generations for an everlasting covenant." What's the promise? He says, to be God to you and to your offspring after you. Here is God making a personal promise to this person Abraham and to his offspring after him. And he says, my promise to you is that I will be God to you. You will be my people. I will be your God. And there will be this relationship between God, who's in heaven, mankind on earth, such that you can say, not there is God, but there is my God. That's what God is starting to do there in Genesis. And then you see how that works out as God calls the people to, he grows the people, he works through them, and the nation starts to grow there in Egypt. Then in Exodus, you get another revelation of what God is going to do in this relationship with these people. So Exodus 25, they've been brought out of Egypt to be his people, and he is going to be their God. And at the beginning of Exodus 25, God starts to give them a new set of instructions. He says to Moses, speak to the people of Israel, they take from me a contribution. And he wants all sorts of things. He wants gold and silver and bronze and goat's hair and scarlet yarn and ram skins and goat skins and wood and oil. What does he want all these things for? Well, he says in verse 8, and let them make me a sanctuary, a holy place. He says, that I may dwell in their midst, exactly as I show you concerning the pattern of the tabernacle and of all its furniture, so you shall make it. And we sort of take this for granted, right? We know they made a tabernacle, and that was where God's name dwelt. But for the people of Israel at this point, and for us if we were reading through the Bible chronologically, this is an amazing thing. Nowhere so far through the Bible has there been any suggestion that God might actually come and dwell with people. Even in the Garden of Eden, God was there, he was coming to them, he would walk in the garden and so on. But even there, we're not told that he dwelt there. But here we're told God's purpose for his people is that there'll be a tabernacle and he will dwell with them. He will dwell in their midst. God is coming to live with his people. And so the second half of Exodus is all God's instructions about the tabernacle and then the activity of building it as all the people throw themselves into this work that God's given them. And you find at the end of Exodus that the tabernacle is finished and God is now doing what he said he would. It's the end of Exodus. The cloud covered the tent of meeting. The glory of the Lord filled the tabernacle. And Moses was not able to enter the tent of meeting because the cloud settled on it and the glory of the Lord filled the tabernacle. God is now dwelling in their midst, in this tent which they've constructed. Here in Leviticus 9, we get the next stage of what God's doing in his relations to people. And he says, now not only will you be my people, I will be your God. Not only will I dwell in your midst, but you will see me. You will see my glory. God will appear to his people in glory. This again is an amazing thing. It's something that you would never have guessed from what's happened so far. But God is going to appear to his people, not just to select few, not just in some fire on the top of the mountain as they got a glimpse back at Sinai, but among his people, there in their midst, his glory is going to appear. And the message of Leviticus is how this can happen. How is it that God's glory can appear to sinful people? How is it that sinful people can see God? And Leviticus is starting to give us the answers to that, as well as the problems that man has when faced with this. How can this happen? I don't know if you spotted as we read through, but I'm going to read a couple of verses again in 8 verse 34 and then in 9 verse 7. This is the way that the people are going to see God's glory. 8 verse 34, as it has been done today, the Lord has commanded to be done to make atonement for you, as for the priests. And then in 9 verse 6 and 7, Moses said, this is the thing the Lord commanded you to do, that the glory of the Lord may appear to you. Then Moses said to Aaron, draw near to the altar and offer your sin offering and your burnt offering, and make atonement for yourself and for the people, and bring the offering of the people and make atonement for them, as the Lord has commanded. There's two things here. Again and again is what the Lord has commanded, is everything that Moses and the people are doing. And the reason for this is because God's commanded it to make atonement for them. And that is the only way, Moses says to Aaron and the priests, that's the only way that God's glory will appear to the people. The Lord has commanded that there must be atonement. Atonement comes from Old English of aton or at one. It's the need to be at one, to be reconciled, to be brought together. And in order for two people who are not together to be brought together, atonement needs to be made. God is the offended party whom mankind's rebelled against. There's this separation now between man who's been driven by God out of his presence and between God himself. But God says there is such a thing as atonement, at-one-ment, bringing back together. And the way that is going to happen is through sacrifice. Atonement is needed if God is going to dwell among them. Now, back in Exodus, Moses begs God that God will let him see his face. And God says, you cannot see my face. So God gives him a glimpse of his glory. He says, you can see my back. At the end of Exodus, Moses himself cannot go into the tabernacle because that's where the glory of God is. No one can go in because God's glory is in there. God says now, for the whole people to see my glory, yes, that is possible. But the only way it's possible is through this thing called atonement, to be reconciled and to have the problem dealt with. What does that look like? What does atonement look like? And the whole of the first half of Leviticus, the parts, if we'd been reading through chronologically, we'd have seen, is about what that looks like. It looks like blood and sacrifice and the smell of burning flesh. That's what's been going on all the way through the first 7 chapters of Leviticus. You've got God's commandments, and then you've got the beginning of the setting up of the priests and the tabernacle and making atonement for it. Sacrifice and blood and death, God says, are the way for atonement. And you can see if you just flick through the first 6 chapters, I think, of Leviticus, verse 7, you'll see all the words in there, all the headings, if you've got headings, are all the laws for burnt offerings, grain offerings, peace offerings, sin offerings. All these offerings for all these different reasons, which Aaron is now making on the altar. All of them together, as you probably caught it when we went through the passage. He's making all these offerings in order that there might be atonement, and that people who are separated from God can now come and see him for themselves. Everything that you read, we read just now in verses 9 to 22, and I won't read it again, where as he kills and as he throws blood and as he burns, that is what it looks like to make atonement. And the other thing you see all the way through those verses is that each one of these things is done as the Lord commanded. Do this where after the service, maybe this afternoon, flick through the first 9 chapters of Leviticus and see how many times it talks about what God has commanded. As the Lord commanded Moses, as the Lord commanded Moses, as the Lord commanded Moses. And everything's being done according to his rule, according to what he has set, because that is the only way that they're going to be able to bridge this gap and to see God and his glory for themselves. And the other thing that you see again and again is that it's to be, it says in this translation, a pleasing aroma to the Lord, an aroma of peace, a smell, if you like, of which brings peace between these two parties which were at war. Atonement, Leviticus is telling us, only happens through blood and sacrifice. And what God's teaching his people through Leviticus is not just his great purpose that mankind will see his glory, but also what the route to that is going to look like. It's not going to be a route that's strewn with flowers and nice smells and all the rest of it. It's going to be a route that smells of blood and death and burning. God is teaching the people that death and blood are going to be needed if he's to dwell with them and if they are to see his glory. This is because that man has sinned. All of us have sinned. We all fall short, as Paul says, of the glory of God. There's no way we can approach it but through sacrifice. Do read some verses from Hebrews 9, because, of course, what all these sacrifices are pointing us to is Jesus to his death on the cross. And the book of Hebrews does a good job of explaining all of that. That's partly what the book of Hebrews is written to do. Because the Jewish people were going, well, shouldn't we go back and do all these sacrifices? I'm going to take my lamb and my goat and all the rest of it. And the writer of the Hebrews says, no, don't, because the whole point of those was to point to what Jesus would do on the cross. And we could read the whole chapter, but I'm just going to read chapter 9, verse 11 and 12. But when Christ appeared as a high priest of the good things that have come, then through the greater and more perfect tent, not made with hands, that is not of this creation, he entered once for all into the holy places, and not by means of the blood of goats and calves, but by means of his own blood, thus securing an eternal redemption. Jesus entered in as priest. Remember, the priests had to first offer for themselves. They spent the first half of that day offering their own sacrifices. Jesus entered in as priest with his own blood, securing an eternal redemption and an eternal atonement for his people. And just skip on to the end of the chapter, verse 23 to 26. Thus it was necessary for the copies of the heavenly things to be purified with these rites, but the heavenly things themselves with better sacrifices than these. For Christ has entered not into holy places made with hands, which are copies of the true things, but into heaven itself, now to appear in the presence of God on our behalf. Nor was it to offer himself repeatedly, as the high priest enters the holy places every year with blood not his own, for then he would have had to suffer repeatedly since the foundation of the world. But as it is, he has appeared once for all at the end of the ages to put away sin by the sacrifice of himself. Those two things there, again, it's all about blood and sacrifice, but what the writer says a couple of times is that the things you read about in Leviticus are there to be a picture. They are a picture of what Jesus has now completed. And so Jesus' death, his sacrifice, his blood, is the way of atonement and the way to see God's glory. God's purpose for us is not, for us to be little Lego men who have no relation to him, but to be people made in his image, people who can see his glory. The only way to that is through atonement. The only way through to that, Leviticus tells us, is through death and blood. And the only way to that is through Jesus, and through his perfect life being sacrificed for us and taking our place as he died on the cross. Let's look at what happens as atonement is made then. And our second point is the blessing of seeing God's glory. Because atonement is made. And even though it is just an animal, it's a picture of what's going to happen. And so the people can now see the glory of God. We find Leviticus 9 again. Aaron blesses God's people. Just as God blessed Adam and Eve when he created them. And finally, he and Moses enter the tabernacle, which they've not yet been able to enter. Verse 12, Aaron lifted his hands toward the people and he blessed them. And he came down from offering the sin offering and the burnt offering and the peace offerings. And Moses and Aaron went into the tent of meeting. And when they came out, they blessed the people. And the glory of the Lord appeared to all the people. Aaron and Moses come back out. Again, they bless the people. And finally, the glory of God appears to everyone. Moses had begged to see God's glory. God only allowed to see his back. When Moses went up the mountain to receive the commandments from God, his face shone with what he was able to see, and his face shone so much that when he came back down, he had to veil his face because the people couldn't see his face and put up with it. But now they don't just simply see Moses' face shining. The glory of God appears. As it says actually here, God himself appears in his glory to every one of those people for whom atonement has been made. Without any veil between them, God's glory appears to them. That's why we say this is one of the high points of the Old Testament, right? This has not happened up to this point. It will happen very few times again afterwards. But at this point, everything is as it should be. They are God's people, face to face with God, able to be before him because atonement has been made for them. And the people, look at how they respond. They shout and they fall down before God. They shout and they fell on their faces. For that brief moment, things are as they should be. There is God and there are his creatures. God's creatures able to live in his presence, see his glory. And it impacts them in these two ways, that they shout out for joy. The shout there is a joyful shout. It's the joyful shout that when the stars shouted for joy when God created the world. And it appears again and again through the book of Psalms when it talks about things and people singing for joy or shouting for joy. That's the same word that we have here. They shout and they sing for joy because finally they see God. There's nothing to come between them because that atonement has taken it away. But at the same time, they fall on their faces. They fall on their faces in awe and in a right fear of God because of who he is. And even with the atonement that's dealt with their sin, there is still a huge difference between who they are and who God is. Here they are seeing the glory of the one who created them, the one who made them, the one who holds them together, the one who created the whole creation, the one to whom the universe is like a tent. Here they are seeing his glory for themselves. And it's not only a joyful thing, but it's a thing which is filled with awe, filled with fear, and they fall on their faces before God. Now for these people, this is sadly only it's for a brief moment. It's a temporary thing because it doesn't last. And we'll see more of that in a moment. As you go on through the book of Leviticus and into the book of Numbers, you find that even the people who saw God's glory for that moment, they rebel against him. They don't care about what God says. They want to do things their way. They want to go back to Egypt where they had garlic, and they are fed up with being in the wilderness where there's no fish. And that's what they care about. And so they go, we want Egypt back, we need the cucumbers. And so they abandon what God has given them, and they refuse to obey him and to go into the land. But even in that, God's purposes still march on, and when we get to Numbers, at each book of the Bible, certainly the first 3 and maybe 4, it shows us something more of God's plan. When we get to Numbers, even with their rebellion against God, Numbers 14, God tells them what he's going to do anyway, regardless of the fact that they have rebelled against him. Numbers 14, verse 20. Moses has just begged of God that he won't destroy the people when they've rebelled against him. And the Lord said, I have pardoned, Numbers 14:20, according to your word. But truly, as I live, and as all the earth shall be filled with the glory of the Lord, none of the men who have seen my glory, and my signs that I did in Egypt, and in the wilderness, and yet have put me to the test these 10 times, and have not obeyed my voice, shall see the land that I swore to give to their fathers. And none of those who despised me shall see it. The people have despised God. They saw his glory. They compared what they had to the pleasure of being back in Egypt, and they said, we despise God. We want to be back in Egypt. But God says it doesn't stop his purpose. And his purpose, he says, is for this. He says the earth will be filled with the glory of God. And he says that will happen as surely and as truly, he says, as I live. As surely as I exist, the earth will be filled with my glory. Even though this was short-lived, and though those people who saw his glory, as God told them, they would never see the land that he promised them, and they would die in the wilderness, God's purposes couldn't be stopped. And in Jesus, we have God fulfilling his promise to those people back in the book of Numbers. You know what John says at the beginning of his gospel? As, John is looking back and he's remembering that time that he spent with Jesus, seeing him, hearing him, being with him, relating to him. It says in John 1 verse 14, it says, the word became flesh and dwelt among us, and we have seen his glory. Glory as of the only Son from the Father, full of grace and truth. In Jesus, God's glory is again seen. And as his gospel and his spirit grow his church and move out through the world, the earth starts to be filled by people who see God's glory. When Jesus was standing in front of the tomb of Lazarus, shortly before his own death and shortly before his crucifixion, he says something very interesting to Martha. He says to Martha, Martha's saying, we are not going to move this stone, it's smelly. He says to Martha, did I not tell you that if you believed, you would see, not you would see Lazarus come out of the tomb, he says you would see the glory of God. He said, you would see the glory of God if you believed. And that's an amazing thing to say, right? It's not an everyday thing that you see the glory of God. It's like, let's have Leviticus chapter 9. What's going to happen? Jesus is going to, what's he going to do? But Martha and the others, they say, right, we're going to move the stone. Lazarus comes out, and they do believe. And they do see in Jesus the glory of God. In 2 Corinthians chapter 4, Paul sums it up like this. He says, for God, in verse 6, who said, let light shine out of darkness. Remember, the God who created everything. He has shone in our hearts to give the light of the knowledge of the glory of God in the face of Jesus Christ. In Jesus, Paul says, we see the glory of God, not just on a special occasion, but every day as we live with him and with his Spirit within us. In our hearts, the light of the knowledge of the glory of God in the face of Jesus Christ. Not merely God's back, but his face, in the face of Jesus Christ. And all of this leads up to God's end purpose in Revelation, where all of this comes together and is completed. Remember I said the three things that we find in Genesis, Exodus, and Leviticus. God will be your God. That's the promise to Abraham. God will dwell with his people. That's the promise to Moses. You will see God. See him for yourself is the promise there to Moses and Aaron. Revelation 21 verse 3. And I heard a loud voice from the throne saying, behold, the dwelling place of God is with man. He will dwell with them, and they will be his people, and God himself will be with them as their God. And then as that happens in Revelation 22, verses 4 and 5, they will see his face, and his name will be on their foreheads, and night will be no more. They will need no light of lamp or sun, for the Lord God will be their light, and they will reign forever and ever. This is what God is doing. God is keeping his promise. God's purpose for mankind is that he will be their God. He will dwell with them, and they will see his face, and the glory of God will give them light. Are we responding to God's glory in the way that these people did? Because to start with, they had a very good response to God's glory, didn't they? They shout for joy. They realize the amazing thing that has happened to them, but they also fall on their faces in awe. Does what we have in Jesus impact us that way today? It will certainly impact us that way when we finally see his glory, as in Revelation 21 and 22. But it should impact us that way today, because we see in the face of Jesus Christ the light of the knowledge of the glory of God. If we have atonement through his blood, that is what we have. We have something which is amazing and something which is beyond price. But finally and briefly, we just see here the danger of God's glory, and Nadab and Abihu, their mistake. Nadab and Abihu are the oldest sons of Aaron. They're not teenagers, they're probably in their 60s or something. Aaron's quite old by now. They're grown men. They are the next priests down from Aaron. And they decide at this point that they are going to take censers. It's a thing used for shaking incense around. They put fire in it, put incense in, and they'll make a much better smell than the smell that's currently pervading the tabernacle. This is something which, as Moses makes very clear, God had not commanded them. Now Nadab and Abihu, the sons of Aaron, each took his censer and put fire in it and laid incense on it and offered unauthorized fire before the Lord, which he had not commanded them. That was meant to strike us because all the way through the first 9 chapters of Leviticus, Moses has said again and again, as the Lord commanded Moses, as the Lord commanded Moses. And it's like, boom, as the Lord had not commanded. God said nothing about incensers in this context. What was going on? They must think they can somehow improve on the situation. Maybe they want to extend it, maybe they want to improve it, maybe they just want the smells to be a bit more pleasant. But they think that this is going to add to their ability to experience God's glory and his holiness. What are they teaching the people there and the people and us as well? No, it's not that, the point of this passage is not, do not use censers in worship. There were plenty of examples where they should use censers in worship, and you see that as you read on through Leviticus. But it's the danger of adding to God's atonement. Adding to God's atonement what he has not commanded us. God was very clear what would make atonement. He was very clear what would allow them to see his glory. And Nadab and Abihu are adding something extra to it. It seems like a small thing, doesn't it? They're not going, oh yeah, we don't want to have sacrifices, we'll do something different. They are the ones who've just done all these sacrifices with Aaron and made everything happen the right way. They're not saying, let's make ourselves a golden calf and offer some incense to that. They are offering this incense to God. But what they're doing is they're saying, we want something extra. Wouldn't it be nice if the way of atonement is we'll have some sacrifices and then we'll have some of our incense that we've prepared for God? What are we in danger of adding to Jesus' sacrifice as something which we think will make us holy? It can be sometimes the particular way we do things, or the fact we're in a nice holy building, or any of those things. We think, if I do this thing, that will make me more acceptable to God. That will make God more pleased with me. It will make me more holy, and therefore I'm more likely to be able to come into God's presence. I'm singing the right sort of hymn, or I'm using the right sort of instrument, or I'm in the right building, or I'm doing these extra bits and pieces. We can all do that, can't we? Whatever church we're from, whatever our background is, we can all be in danger of adding things to the process of making ourselves holy. What is it that you're depending on for holiness? Is it that I do things this way, or I am this sort of person, or I have this sort of background, or I am this sort of religious experience, or this sort of religious thing that I do? Or is it simply that Jesus is a sacrifice who died and his blood was shed to make atonement for you? Obviously, as people who have had Jesus make atonement for us, we do worship God, and there were plenty of opportunities for them to use their senses later on in Leviticus. But atonement is only through Jesus. Nothing that we do is going to add to that. Nothing that we do is going to make that better, or make it longer lasting, or make it more certain than the fact that Jesus has been sacrificed for us. This is what God says. This is the lesson that God wants the people and us to take from the death of Nadab and Abihu. Moses said to Aaron, verse 3, "This is what the Lord has said, among those who are near me, I will be sanctified, and before all the people, I will be glorified." Having access to God's presence and being those who are near him, it doesn't lessen his holiness. We must never forget how we have that access to him. We must never think that we somehow, in what we do, have made ourselves holy enough to approach God. If we're going to see his glory, if we're going to experience his holiness, then we depend on that entirely, on him. Among those who are near me, God says, I will be sanctified. Before all the people, I will be glorified. But gloriously, coming through Jesus Christ, we can see God's glory. We can see him for ourselves. We will spend eternity in his presence, with him dwelling with us as our God, seeing his face, with his name on our foreheads, and him as our light and our glory. We're going to sing as we finish now. So we're going to sing Yet Not I, but Through Christ in Me. And we have some accompaniment for this one, I think. But again, the words will be on the screen. We don't have this in the book, unfortunately, but the words should be fairly clear on the screen. So please do stand and sing.